Okay, I'll be quiet then.
Now we're live. It's too late. You can't be quiet. Hello everyone from the future. I am Patrick, your co-host for Uncertain Futures, here with Joan Summers Donnelly. Uh, um,
Yes, that's right, Patrick. I'm the host. You're the co-host.
did I say that? Did I say that you were? Did I give you the title of? I'm sorry. I'm multitasking.
No, you just
Now we're
started by
back.
saying you
Now
just
we're
started by saying co-host, which is actually correct, technically correct. But yeah,
Very good. Well,
just sounds funny to first
technically
say co-host.
correct is the best thing I to have said about you, in my opinion. Um, so now I am dropping you the link. Kablamo, there it is. And I'm also going to go ahead and drop that link in the Discord server, which isn't our official Discord server because we don't have one yet, but we certainly will. Although, they look quite busy. But anyway, we'll pump it up anyway. And I'm also going to send it here in the general chat. Very good. So how have you been, Joan? How was your week? How are you feeling? How's the weather? How's the coronavirus? How's college?
um, I don't know. I don't even know. I don't even know where to start this week. It's a lot of fucked up things going on this week.
It's a pretty rough
Um,
week.
yes. But yeah, I don't know. Here, the sun is gone from today, um, which I don't know. It's got its pros, it's got its cons. Yeah, I don't know. What about there? Let's just keep the talk about the weather now, shall we?
Well, actually, right now the sun is finally
Well,
coming out. We've had a few days of oppressive cloud, which only is oppressive relative to the glorious sunshine we had before. Um, I expect that we'll be back to not enough rain and too much heat, and I expect that we won't be complaining.
you expect the what?
That we won't be complaining.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Um, yeah. And as I was saying to you, like, bars and cafes are opening here on Monday, which is really a strange concept to me. I don't know. I'm so used to now living in a city where those things don't exist. Um, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I
I don't
mean,
know.
last time I was in a bar in Belgium, it was in Brussels, and I had to go to the bar to wait for our mutual friend Natalie, who was going to host me for an evening before I moved on. Um, and I got into the bar, and I was so embarrassed for I'd been walking all day with no real direction because Natalie was at work, and then when I got there, I felt like I wanted to fit in, so I bought a drink. I can't remember what drink it was. All I know is it cost €19, and predictably,
What?
yeah.
What did you order?
I don't know. It was literally, I picked something that sounded normal.
Yeah, what do you mean sounds normal?
It's just the where it was positioned in the bar. There was no price tag next to it. It seemed like it was just some kind of
Uh,
standard, but it definitely wasn't. And it added,
well, yes,
yeah,
it had a what?
it just added to my frustration that had been building all day.
Oh no! And wait, did it taste nice? What did it taste like?
I wasn't satisfied, and I had to drink it for a very long time.
Oh
Um,
no! Was it a beer?
no, it was some kind of cocktail. I mean, obviously, if it's €19,
Oh well, cocktail. Well, Patrick, you didn't you didn't say that before. I mean, you're kind of asking for financial trouble if you're going to order cocktails.
yeah, it would seem to be the case. Although, I don't order many cocktails, so I wouldn't know this. Usually, they're just prepared for me by Josh Burden.
Yes. Well, welcome to the real world where cocktails cost like way too much money. Like so. Anyway, you learned your lesson not to order a cocktail in a bar because apparently, unless it's like some kind of like Bernard Shaw back in the day, two for a tenner deal or something, or like I don't know, cocktail
What was
Tuesday or something.
Copan? I
Cocktail
remember.
apparently. Yes, Copan exactly.
Yeah,
Yes,
they did like something crazy, like two cocktails for a
it was
fiver or something on a Thursday. I
It was
was.
like, so yeah, some kind of two for the price of one
It was
type
nuts.
thing. I think I was there once for that, but anyway,
Well,
unless those that kind of situation, apparently they can call charge you anything they want for a cocktail in a bar, and
yeah.
it's legal. So yeah, but I was just thinking it might have been a beer because I was like, well, here you can actually order very expensive beer because you're like, oh, it's some very special, specific from this tiny brewery under a I don't know bridge in the Ardennes in Wallonia, and I don't know, it's made by trolls or I don't know. They have all this. They have all this. This is a very bad like I don't know ramble, but basically they have a lot of special beers here, you know. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course.
yeah.
We're only new to the
Okay,
special
well,
beers.
should we? Oh, you should give us a little spiel about
Oh, of
what
course.
this is
Yeah, this we're here.
because only you are allowed to do that.
Yeah, it was just got too confusing. This is Uncertain Futures, a podcast where myself and my co-host Joan, to be very precise, just try to look into all the weird possibilities of the future that perhaps sometimes they get mentioned, sometimes they don't get mentioned. The real point is that today we're all living in a circumstance that we would not have anticipated beforehand, and maybe this show will help you worry about future versions of that. And sometimes it's not even worry; sometimes they're good. So that was perhaps a little less succinct
Shockingly.
than the previous introductions, but yeah, that's essentially the gist.
That's okay.
As I understand it, it is now my turn to begin. Is that correct, John?
That is correct.
Very good.
You're technically correct again. Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna continue on from where we were last week, actually, and I'm gonna take it kind of slow, because if I remember correctly, last week when I was discussing materials, and there are lots of just basic, materials in and of themselves that deserve revisiting, forever in the future in this show and in conversations. Lots of exciting possibilities. But one of the things that I was interested in, sort of thematically, about the materials is how they sort of seem to break the rules that we might have had before. The point is they had properties, a lot of these materials, that were unpredictable, or sometimes people predict properties in materials that are very unlike what we have today. So it shows that there's something that can sort of emerge from these structures and these features and these weird quantum characteristics of different materials. And we ended on the question of using materials that are actually essentially living material. Now, that was the example of bone buildings. Do you remember the bone buildings?
Oh, do I remember the bone building? I really want a bone building.
Well,
I don't know. That's kind of weird, but it's a cool concept.
it is a cool concept, and the only thing that makes it especially weird is the idea that we would synthetically produce the bone. Now, as a little aside, last week I mentioned that that's kind of tricky because the current means we would have to produce bone would involve using collagen as a raw material, and collecting a lot of collagen to build stuff is a slightly dystopian, zombie-ish prospect for which we are not entirely prepared. Collagen being the most common. Oh no, I better close that old Facebook until we get notifications. There we go. So the example of using bone does seem very strange, although of course using living material as a material, or formerly living material, is very, very old. Wood would have been one of the perhaps most important materials to the largest number of people a long time ago. But now, we have entered into a world where there's the possibility of using living material and producing it in ways that we never could before. And there's a lot of different examples of this. So I'm going to try and sort of make sure I don't just rush through things and list things. But perhaps the first one that has drawn people's attention, and which is featured a lot in of course comic books, is spider web. The idea that we could produce synthetically produce spider silk has been on a lot of people's minds for a long time. There are, I think, my favorite example, of course, are the goats that have been genetically engineered with genes from spiders to produce the proteins for spider silk in their milk. So they have spider silk milk.
Spider silk milk sounds so good.
You got spider silk milk goats out there, and it's still a tricky process. We're still struggling basically to crack the nut of cheaply producing spider silk. It's now pretty popular, pretty well known that spider silk has a lot of great properties. It's stretchy but stronger than steel. It has cool properties in terms of friction, in terms of catching things, etc. And so that'd be one example. But I guess what you see in these living materials is that the emergent properties become more expansive because the materials themselves become more complex, right? Because there is larger and larger superstructure to the materials. You could even, and this isn't sci-fi, take the most complex thing in terms of what people like to think of as complex in biology, i.e. nervous systems and things like our brain, and you can even synthetically produce them. You can inculcate them on different tissues or different mediums, and you can actually take this synthetic brain stuff and you can get it to do things. You can get it to, for example, run flight simulators. So yeah, the sky really is the limit, I think, when it comes to using these materials. And I think that synthetic biology is a big part of the reason why in the scientific community you'll often have people saying that the 20th century was the century of physics and the 21st century will be the century of biology. There's a huge expectation that at some point these materials are going to start coming out and they're going to just change everything about how we live.
Move over, physics.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, as a little side note, the story of how physics got really popular, I mean, it got really popular. I don't know if we appreciate that after World War II, especially in the United States, physicists were...
By popular, you mean like a lot of breakthroughs were made?
No, I mean that everybody thought that physicists were like really cool, amazing magicians. Like if you were a physicist, then you'd be getting invited to all the parties. In fact, there was actually some edition of some socialite magazine which said that no tea party is no dinner function is complete without a physicist. and this came with huge amounts of federal funding because the idea was they were viewed as this essential resource to have in the context of conflict.
Hang on, but does that mean that if this century now is the century of biology, does that mean we have to wait another 100 years before the century of chemistry and bone houses?
I think we've just skipped chemistry. I think they're perennially underappreciated.
Heck's sake.
Yeah, I know. It's a shame. It's a shame. But we know once it's.
But it's the best one.
I'm a fan.
The alchemy one.
Oh yeah, the alchemist.
I guess back in the alchemy days, maybe that was the century of chemistry.
Absolutely. I mean, Isaac Newton totally considered his role as. I mean, a lot of people point out that he was an alchemist. There is a contention that he was merely trying to determine if lesser metals could be turned into gold so that he could protect the currency, because he was in charge of he was what's the name of the title again? Basically he had some head treasury position, and it's thought that he considered.
It's like in Monopoly, like if you're the banker and then you're like, oh great, I can steal from the bank now. Yeah. He's just like, we'll just make loads of gold and just.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think he was. Although I don't know. I've read some of his stuff that suggests he was actually quite enamored with a lot of sort of ideas of ancient knowledge, which is still a popular theme amongst conspiracy theorists. The idea that we used to know more scientific information than we do now, and it was lost, in some cataclysm or whatever.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
but okay, sorry, I'm a tangent from what you were wanting to get into.
Yeah. Well, just let's settle on one example of, I think, a really interesting synthetic material that we can develop already, and which we're almost certainly going to get better at developing, which will have huge economic impacts and huge impacts potentially on the climate, and that is synthetic meat or synthetic milk or synthetic cheese. So we already have those. I mean, have you heard of Impossible Burger and all that kind of stuff? Have you ever had any of this stuff? I've never had the chance.
Not the impossible burger. Mm, yeah, like what stuff do you mean when you say like I've had various fake
Fake
meat
meats.
and dairy products, but
Yeah. Oh, I'm
but
talking
you
about
mean
the
lab
stuff
meat,
that tries to. So in the case of the Impossible Burger, they use heme.
like lab created. I
Yeah,
mean, not like sorry, not lab grown meat, but like they make things in the lab, like they kind
yeah.
of
It's not
yeah
fully lab grown meat,
yeah.
which is possible already, although not scalable at the moment. Instead, they
Mm-hmm.
focus on Impossible Burger, whatever they're called, is to produce heme, the protein that is a component of hemoglobin, and they argue that this is what really gives meat its taste, and they make that a bunch, and then they add it to other more kind of more typical meat alternatives to give people this meaty taste. I've heard good things, but that's not the only game in town. There are other competing ideas, and
Yeah.
I mean it's hard to say with something like this, as it is with 3D movies or something like that. Is this the new reality,
A fad.
or is it faddish? I mean, I
Yeah.
say
Oh God,
faddish.
remember 3D movies?
I say faddish because I do think that, to me, there's something, on a fundamental level, the idea that you can replicate the structure and taste and essentially kind of function of a burger in vitro it seems like it should be feasible, and it seems like if once you crack it, it should be not only much more ethical and less harmful to the environment, but it also should be cheaper than
hmm
giving birth to and raising an organism. I know you don't. I
Yeah.
know
When
you
was the
don't.
last time you did that, Patrick?
Well, I'm not a farmer.
Or cow. But to be honest, I'm much more skeptical about the lab grown cheese or milk than
Oh,
I am the
really?
meat, to be honest. But I'm saying that as someone who hasn't eaten meat for quite a few years, so
So,
uh,
what makes you skeptical?
I guess so I'm sure there's people who are just big meat eaters. I'm sure are just as skeptical as I am about the dairy thing
But wait,
with
sorry,
meat.
I'm curious why you're skeptical of the milk or meat. To be honest, it's just milk for milk and cheese, because you make cheese for milk. If you can make good milk, you can make cheese.
Yeah, I know what cheese is, Patrick.
No, I'm. But why are you skeptical?
Just because I've tried many. I have at times attempted to cut out dairy. I mean, like the real deal dairy from my diet.
Yes,
And
yes.
so I've tried various cheeses that are not cheeses and yogurt that's not yogurt. And so far that I don't think they have had not there's not much you know I think they haven't had much success with it, basically. Like, you can get something that is like to cook with in terms of cheese, like to put cheese into something that's going to melt or whatever, like that will kind of do the job, I suppose.
Yeah.
And then there's that whole like yeast flake thing, which uh,
I guess
adds
I
some kind
wonder.
of flavor. But yeah, I don't know. I just think so far, yeah, I think just so far I haven't really seen many good results there. So
I
I
kind
don't know.
of feel that I actually feel like making a convincing steak should be harder than making. Uh, it doesn't even. It's not even a question of convincing. It's sort of uh, if it is just an accurate replication. I mean, so I when you look down at the breakdown of like how much what different kinds of proteins have you got in milk, for example, or so milk has basically some sugar in the form of lactose. It's got various amounts of protein, um, various types of protein in cow milk, and you've got the fats, and you've also got caseins, which are relatively important for absorbing the proteins, although that's not really the matter that I'm concerned with. And then there are a few other complicated things, like, living white blood cells, which are thought to confer immunity. In the case of course, breast milk for humans. But I guess I think that because it's just a liquid with a mixture of things in it, if you can just synthetically produce either all or most of the literal compounds that are there and just mix them in, then you've done the job. You've got synthetic milk, and no one can tell the difference. Whereas for meat, you've got all this superstructure. You've got how the way in which the cells are connected to each other and the way in which it tears apart, etc., is going to be a part of how people perceive whether or not it's the real deal.
See, I think that's just what you just said this there. Maybe you have a point, but I think it's a bit discriminatory towards milk, to be honest. That milk is just some liquid, and if you just have some flavors, like, I think there's actually also a lot going on in milk that is very hard to replicate,
Perhaps.
But then, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, for me, like, as more of a dairy connoisseur than a meat eater, in that I don't eat meat. Like, I guess I would say that, like, I would be like, it's easier for me now, having not eaten meat for quite a few years, to eat some kind of fake meat thing that I'm like, Jesus, this is very like meat. Like, even that place on McGuinness's on Camden Street, they have creepily meat like seitan-based, say, like chicken nuggets and things. In that I almost couldn't eat them because I was like, this just feels like I'm eating chicken, like kind of chicken goujon thing. Like,
well,
it was very strange.
I am
I'm not really the one to be. I know it's. I probably also don't have such a good meat taste memory or something. If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I just think there's also a lot going on with dairy. But anyway, this is just my own prejudice.
I'm interested in these details, certainly.
Yes, but yeah. I guess you haven't talked much about it.
Yeah, no. Yeah. But what I'm also curious about is, how do you think people would react to? Let's leave the dairy aside for a moment. Let's assume that we end up producing very convincing fake meat. And I say fake is a bit of a weird word to throw in. It's kind of loaded. What I really mean is synthetic meat. So you're still creating the living proteins, or the proteins as produced in living systems. But it of course hasn't come from any animal. And I'm actually sort of just a little bit curious, how that would go down. It feels like it could still be very unpopular amongst those who have foregone meat, and if that's the case, then that would kind of hurt its success as a competitor to real meat. Do you think that makes any sense?
Wait, that you think it's more something that, like, for people who don't eat meat anyway?
Well, no, I'm actually thinking that maybe people who don't eat meat anyway wouldn't like it. But I could be wrong. I wonder if, because it is physically the same stuff, and because it'll have essentially an association that's very strong with real meat, and it'll also have an association with processed food, whether or not it nutritionally is like processed food, but because it has been produced in this like deeply processed way. Do you think that people who have, vegetarians basically would be on average well disposed?
Oh, whether they eat it or not?
Disposed towards fake meat, yeah.
I mean, I suppose it depends on the vegetarian. We're not a uniform. If you meet one vegetarian, you've met one vegetarian. I don't know. Yeah, I can't. Yeah, but I'm not sure about that. But I suppose it depends, because actually, isn't there the issue that at the moment, to make lab cultured meat, they still need to use some kind of like blood from a unborn calf to? Do you know about this? That basically it's not vegan, and it's also even not without cruelty. If you think, that taking, yeah.
I honestly, I think that would depend on the specific process that you're looking at. I think it's.
But I just don't know if have they do you know if they've already made like lab cultured meat, so meat sort of grown in a lab, without that would be vegan, like without using any animal product.
I mean, the main approach in synthetic biology wouldn't technically be that, but it wouldn't technically be vegan because you would be going off a cell culture from the animal itself in order to produce it. Now, that's sort of
Say that again?
So in a sort of simplified, typical sense, if you wanted to produce beef using synthetic biology, you would want actual cells from cows, real ones, that you could then reproduce in culture and then grow under certain conditions to produce the meat. Now, the reality is nobody has ever actually produced lab-grown meat in the sense of it being structurally identical to meat. It's all just a question of how many adjustments you have to make so as to provide enough structure for people to perceive it as meat. But they're still going to be using real cells, and I suppose that in itself poses an interesting question, because you say, is it technically vegan or not? So let's say you had successfully produced a synthetic meat product which required no continual input from, like, you didn't need to get cartilage or anything like that for the growing of the meat, but you did initially get the cells from a real animal. Do you think that? I guess, yeah. I mean, I know these are questions that you can't answer for everyone. Of course, that's not really what I'm asking. But where do you think you can really draw a line? Because to me, even though I do eat meat, although less than I used to, it would strike me as a net good on many fronts if we could have meat produced from, one cell line that a long time ago was taken from a cow, than if we were continuously slaughtering cows for the meat. Are you there, Joe?
Oh yes, I am there. Sorry, I thought you were gone. Wait, what was the last thing you said then?
I'm just wondering how you would compare, like, morally, the question of using, basically, how significant is it that the cells may have originally come, or the progenitor cells for producing a meat culture may have come from a real animal?
Well, how would I feel about that? How would I feel about that? Sorry, funny sentence. Well, like, I suppose I think that if it was, yeah, I suppose it's about also the circumstances of how that is done. If it still means, yeah, I think it's better than yeah, I suppose farming animals. Like, I suppose. So if it's how do I feel about it, my main motivation for being vegetarian is an environmental. It would be an environmental one. So if the environment, I'm imagining the environmental impact. I mean, yeah, would be much less.
It should be.
So yeah, I already think that's a plus. But I suppose there's people who might think anything connected to an animal. So I can imagine there's other vegetarians who wouldn't want to engage with that. Engage with that kind of burger.
Of course.
Yeah, but I think it's the thing of the perception thing of it is kind of interesting, or like, because a lot of people who just like the idea of eating animals and want to eat meat and thinks like humans just that we're supposed to eat meat and everything. So I think changing people's, like, so actually this kind of Impossible Burger, like trying to really all these burgers they're trying to make to bleed like a burger, and they are I think aiming them at meat eating people who maybe want to reduce their meat consumption. And I think that is the correct way to be marketing stuff, because actually a lot of vegetarians, they're not into necessarily this like fake meat products.
Yeah,
some people are, but I think that's going to be the bigger impact. Like, that's the bigger market anyway. Although there's a lot of people who aren't vegetarian, but among places where meat eating is very common, or people eat a lot of meat, and yeah, vegetarianism is on the rise, but still probably a minority of people, like saying like in Europe, and in Europe anyway, and yeah, like I think rather than trying to, I think people should be trying to target things that people who maybe want to eat less meat but want to still have something that's like meat, So maybe it's not so important what the vegetarians think, but no, not that it's not, but you know what I mean. It's not central in terms of like I think if they can make something that it's also not about the price thing because you know if you can make something that's less, that's say cheaper than meat, you know, the cheap like a steak that's cheaper than
Yeah.
actually buying a steak, but that tastes pretty good. You
I
know, maybe it's going to end up being like a Tesco version, like a Tesco value thing, and it's like
yeah. Well,
people are
see,
like, oh yeah, it's not the real thing, but you know, it's still pretty, you know, for the price, it's pretty good.
I'd actually be pretty optimistic there. I think if you manage to make meat at least not awful, and if you manage to make it cheaply, like using synthetic biology, then
Mm.
I actually while there might be some holdout amongst very particular groups, super rich people or people who hunt, for example, who could make a reasonable argument that they're culling a particular species or something. I actually think that the prospect of I basically think that meat eaters can only be so small a proportion of the population before it becomes the consensus. The consensus kind of flips, and suddenly it's viewed by everyone as morally abhorrent. Which I know is a slightly strange thing to say as somebody who still does eat meat, but I genuinely don't think that it's possible for it to be kind of morally sustainable if you don't have a critical mass of the population engaged in it.
Um, yeah, wait, sorry, but developing this kind of meat
No, no,
was
like eating real meat. I think that killing animals to eat meat it can only be morally acceptable in society if above a certain percentage of people are doing it. I think if that percentage drops, as it would if synthetic meat became cheaper, then if
mm,
only 10% of people were eating meat, I think the 90% of people would start very much judging them.
yeah.
That's just a
It's all
guess.
it's all about the it's all the it's the economy, stupid. Yeah.
It's the economy. Yeah, it's sort of not, but yes. So I mean,
Yeah, yeah, no, but you know, I think the price that like as well, say
oh
especially
yeah,
like
yeah,
in
yeah,
the
yeah.
States or something, in terms of how almost like subsidized meat it
Oh
is, you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
how cheap
Same
meat
in
is
Ireland.
compared
Same in
to like
Ireland.
yeah, exactly. So um yeah, but it's already interesting, like say here that like vegetarian like burgers and stuff. There's a lot of kind of like vegan, vegetarian versions of meat things in the supermarket, like way more products like that here, and they're cheaper because it's more popular. So it's already, you know, you can already see the difference compared to Ireland. That
Yeah,
yeah, that stuff is cheaper here, and there's more different variety. There's more different brands. There's kind of like higher end stuff and like cheaper stuff, and yeah.
yeah. No, when I watch it,
So
yeah, many supermarkets in Europe sort of make me feel a confused regret. Um,
but that's a just a great standalone sentence, whatever the context. But why do you feel, what's this confused regret you feel?
well, the regret is that I don't, usually have access to this much, variety and quality at such low cost, and the confusion
That's a
is
weird thing to regret. I
yeah.
mean, just like,
Well, I guess I could have chosen to spend more time in countries that had Lidl by the time I was 4, and yeah,
could have lived such a different life.
I could have lived such a different life. I could have had so many more delicious meals. Even the microwavable meals are better. You know what I mean? It's a whole different.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, I will just jump through. I mean, there's a few of the
Yes.
topics for which this stuff is incredibly relevant. Obviously, GMOs themselves represent a sort of aspect of synthetic biology and the production of new materials that is, pretty exciting and offers a lot of opportunities. It's very controversial, and I think that my just just skipping over that page, I think that the controversy surrounding GMOs that I find reasonable is usually related to not the technology itself directly in all of its applications, but the manner in which it's implemented today by large agri companies, which are often deserving of a lot of criticism. But nonetheless, the idea that you could use these same principles to produce foods in much cheaper ways, or in much less environmentally harmful ways, or just in ways that just can't be achieved in that particular environment without the intervention, is tremendously exciting, and it kind of harkens back to notions of, as does of course synthetic meat, the notions that we could be going towards a future, potentially, if we make the right decisions, that actually we're not constantly tearing down biodiversity, and we could provide for ourselves, even a growing population, without causing immense destruction. Another interesting area is of course in medicine. So our ability to manipulate cells directly. I mean, the interventions or the experiments that were super crucial related to stem cells, of course. They an ability to progress or regress stem cells in various ways allows us to actually engineer the on some level sort of the age of tissue, so as to of course intervene when there's been some traumatic injury of some kind, but also to provide for more chronic conditions where people are losing that capacity for regeneration, and that's all very, very exciting. I just, because there's a limited amount of time before we got to get on to your topic, which I'm excited to hear about, I just wanted to draw your attention and any listeners' attention to the creations of David Cronenberg.
Yes.
Because I actually think to me that captures something super cool and creepy and real or something about a future in which we really use biology to design technologies for ourselves. So do you have any David Cronenberg movies that you can think of where you see weird living technology weirdness?
Where you see what? Sorry?
I don't know if you've seen any films where he has like a gun that's actually also alive and has an eyeball, and it like pierces into people. It does all this weird stuff, but it's not supposed to be just it's kind of a mix between a technology or a tool, but it's also a living system. Yeah, so that's
yes, that's what.
Well, that's just sort of like to me, if you kind of open up your, like, that's kind of, for me, it's the easiest way to open up your mind to how many things could potentially be possible with this kind of approach. The reality is living systems are incredibly flexible. They can do a huge variety of things, and we are slowly getting good at controlling how those things get done. And there could be a world in which David Cronenberg-esque inventions, although hopefully not also destructive in capacity, could abound. That's what I'm saying.
Interesting. Yeah, I suppose that was looping back around to what you were saying at the start about like materials that could become like living systems or like have brain type functions.
Yeah, that you do see a lot of that, all right. Yeah, but I mean the brain part is of course the most. I mean, the idea that we could. I mean, it's obvious to us that we can integrate with the functionality of some material or some tool, and we've given loads of examples of that in this episode and the last one. But if you're talking about actually having, which again we have done, thinking material existing in culture, it's kind of creepy and weird. But if ever we were able to actually interface successfully with this, using brain-computer interfaces, as you covered in the episode before the last one, I believe it was, then suddenly, our at that point it's very difficult to sort of have any kind of futuristic discussion about it, because it becomes so the possibilities become so expansive that it's just confusing, I find, to really try and project.
Yeah, again, back to the thing of like, it's just hard to predict the future.
Yeah, it's pretty tricky. It's pretty tricky.
But we still just, I don't know. Well, we're not trying to predict the future. We're just talking about all the different crazy things that it could be.
Indeed.
Cool.
Well, that's my sort of continuing of the rabbit hole regarding materials into materials of life. And now I'm excited to hear what you've been thinking about.
Yes. So apology for if I was proselytizing a little too hard about dairy and how it is irreplaceable. Um, I come from a long line of dairy farmers, so I gotta,
Really?
I gotta, you know, yeah. I come from big dairy, just a disclaimer.
My favorite name is the Milk Industrial Complex. There's a YouTube channel called Healthcare Triage where he talks about the milk industrial complex, and it's a real thing. Like
Yeah,
huge
totally. Yeah.
government subsidies.
Yeah, yeah. No, no, I mean, despite well, I don't have stakes in the. It's not like we're my family. I'm a dairy farmer or something. But yeah, despite some uh, yeah personal connections, I don't know. I do, yeah, begrudgingly acknowledge the existence of, I don't know, big dairy, the milk industrial complex. I don't. Um, okay, but yes, enough about that. Okay, so my topic is less like imagining or like thinking of and discussing the feasibility and desirability of an imagined future that is yet to come, and more on the side of looking at a historical imagining of the future that maybe we've already arrived at. Um, and yeah, by historical, it's also a fictional one, science fictional one. Um, yeah. So Patrick, are you? Yeah, we talked about a bit before. I mean, we've talked several times before about the fact that sci-fi, yeah, science fiction, like movies and books and such, yeah, can shape a lot how we how we think about the future, which I think also shapes what we do about getting there or trying not to get to that kind of future, say in this kind of like dystopias created by, say, science fiction writers. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of, and it's kind of had a bit of a in the last few years. It's had a bit of a I don't say comeback, but like basically, I think dystopian fiction has been having kind of a moment,
Yeah.
which I suppose is good for dystopian fiction writers. Maybe not good for like what's going with the word, like why it's happening is maybe not good. I don't know. Anyway, Patrick, have you heard of a book called The Parable of the Sower?
I have not.
Okay. Well, The Parable of the Sower is a science fiction novel written in 1993, so not that long ago. And then what came out in the book that followed it, kind of only a 2-book series. It was meant to be a trilogy, but didn't become a trilogy. Is the Parable of the Talented, and they are books by Octavia E. Butler, who was a American, sci-fi author, an African American sci-fi author, and yeah, I think she's not. I mean, she definitely has like within sci-fi. Got a lot of recognition and praise and like awards and like the MacArthur Genius Grant, I think. But yeah, there were a lot of people were in the last few years. Also bookshops had like in the shelves, and there was also like remakes or TV shows and stuff made of things like or people watching again version like old film stuff of like 1984 and like The Handmaid's in 1984 by George Orwell and The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, and yeah, are you familiar with those books?
Yes, I have actually read both of those books. Although QI tells me that everyone lies about having read 1984, I'm determined that I'm an exception.
And what?
And I'm determined that I'm an exception.
Yeah, okay, well, good for you. I'm not gonna either way, it's fine. It's a safe space to put what books you have and haven't read. But anyway, I'm not gonna find you out because I'm not gonna talk about 1980. because there's a lot of talk about 1984. But so yeah, there's like definitely elements of 1984 and say The Handmaid's Tale, like which is specifically looks at kind of say like control of like reproduction and yeah, reproductive rights and stuff. So there's a lot of things that obviously chime with and like the kind of I suppose authoritarianism of the world of 1984, like chimes with maybe some things that have been happening in the world in the last few years. But I think the parable of the of yeah, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about like the setting of the parable of the sower. And yeah, basically it's in. Hang on now, I just got to find my notes so I don't make up too much shit. So it's it's set in Los Angeles in the year 2024, and so global warming has created droughts and there's rising sea levels, and like the middle class people and poor, like working poor people live in kind of gated communities, and then there's like they have walls and they have like guns to protect themselves from people who don't live in that area, and then so the fresh water is really scarce, so it's really valuable. Yeah, there's a lot of fires, and the police. It costs money to like use like police services, so a lot of people don't use them, and it's also just not really. They're not very few people trust the police anyway. Yeah, public schools, like most public schools, have been privatized. Like there's whole towns that have been privatized. Yeah, and then there's like
so it's paradise.
Well, a libertarian paradise, yeah. So and then there's the protagonist is a 15-year-old black girl called Lauren Oya Alamina. So she lives in one of these walled neighborhoods. And yeah, she talks about like people have changed the climate of the world and now they're waiting for the old days to come back. And so she basically she starts she kind of starts equipping herself to survive in this future where she just feels like it's gonna somehow things are gonna go backwards in the world, and she collects like maps and books on how Native Americans use plants, and she develops her own kind of belief system called Earthseed. And so it's kind of this like Darwinian religion, basically, that kind of almost like worships evolution and change and constant adaptation, and so that we should be really flexible and and kind of orient ourselves towards like the world around us and the universe and stuff. So yeah, that's basically the main setup of that. And then the next, so I won't go into all the plot of the book, but that's just kind of the setting that it's in. And then the next book comes like 4 years, like so it's in like set in 2032, I think it is. And so basically things have gotten even more dystopian. It's in the US in the start of the book, and it has come under the grip of a Christian fundamentalist denomination called Christian America, led by President Andrew Steele Jarrett, and he's seeking to restore like American power and prestige. And he goes on this crusade to cleanse America of non-Christian faiths. And slavery has resurfaced with shock collars used to control these slaves. And then people have these like virtual reality headsets called dream masks, and they're very popular because people can like escape the harsh reality of this, of where they're living, and kind of like go on these virtual reality dreams. And so that's kind of like the main sort of entertainment or something. So your man, Jared. Wait, where is it now? Because I'm a quote from the book that I wanted to. Sorry. Yeah, and that like there's this. Where is this? Anyway, basically, it's like he accuses this Jarrett guy. He like accuses different whole groups of people of being rapists and drug dealers, and he like his supporters like form mobs and burn people to death, and like he this quote from the book is that he condemns their violence in such mild language that his people are free to hear what they want to hear. And yeah, he wants to return the country to a simpler bygone era. And his slogan is, you guessed it, let's make America great again.
My God.
Yeah.
So wait, when was this written?
Sound familiar? Yeah, so I just think it's just interesting because it's like very, I don't know, there's a lot of parallels between, yeah, what's going on in America in the last few years since their current president was elected, what's going on right now, and yeah, I don't know. I just think it's interesting that it's not. I know there were like, there was a bit of a surge in popularity, or like people started to read this book again around time that 2016, 2017. But it's also, yeah, I'm kind of surprised it wasn't really like in the, because actually this is one of the few. I just started reading it. It's like one of the few books that I have here, and I've been like reading much more. Like novels during the lockdown than I had been managing to before, and so yeah, I was just like, oh, hang on, it's a very straight. Like it just happens to be the time that I started reading it. I didn't even know that much what it was about, and now I was like, wow, this is a
eerie.
Yes. What?
Eerie.
Yuri?
Eerie.
Eerie. Yes, somewhat, yeah. But and actually, the thing about Make America Great Again is, I mean, this book was written, the second book was written in 1998. So actually, there had already been, Reagan had the slogan, yeah, something similar. Let's make America great again. Something like that. It was just slightly different from Trump's one. And yeah, I mean, so actually, it's yeah, of course, it's not like totally new rhetoric. And apparently, the character is kind of based on Reagan, I think. So, but yeah, does go to a further extreme that then say what happened in the Reagan years. That does, I don't know. It's yeah, there's kind of a lot there. I mean, in these books, yeah, feels to be very like yeah, like you said, kind of an eerie or like a yeah, prescient or something.
Yeah.
And yeah, so yeah, so I thought I didn't want to like, I mean, I want to talk about this book, so this future scenario that Octavia Butler was writing about. But what I actually, when I was kind of looking into it, what I kind of maybe wanted to talk about more is, or look at was, say, her view on science fiction as a phenomenon, and okay. Like I suppose its function. So I suppose taking a little bit of more of a meta take on the thing, or view on the thing, because she gave some interesting interviews and wrote some interesting essays about science fiction and yeah, how she sees her role as a science fiction writer. Yeah, I just want to.
So what was her take?
So she wrote this. What?
What was her take?
What did you say?
What was her take on the?
Oh, what was her take? Well, okay. So she wrote this essay originally in like 2000 for Essence magazine, and so she starts by saying that this student came up to her when she was signing books one time after a talk and said, "So do you really believe that in the future we're going to have the kind of trouble you write about in your books?" And so he was talking about these two books I just talked about, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. So yeah, then she writes about it's like the future of increasing drug addiction and literacy, and there's way more prisons, and like everything's being privatized, and there's like a growing economic inequality and like racial inequality, and yeah, the global warming, all that jazz. And then she said to him, I didn't make up the problems. All I did was look around at the problems we're neglecting now and give them about 30 years to grow into full-fledged disasters. And so he said, okay, then what's the answer? And so she said, there isn't one. And so then he said, no answer. Do you mean we're just doomed? And then she said, no. Turn off your phone, Patrick.
Sorry.
Oh God. Um, we should do that little cinema thing at the start of the podcast, but for the purpose of us silencing our phones.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then she said, no, I mean, there's no single answer that will solve all of our future problems. There's no magic bullet, but there are thousands of answers, at least thousands, and you can be one of them if you choose to be. So then she said a few days later, she got in the post a copy of the a story in the college newspaper that this guy wrote about her books and also about this conversation with her. And yeah, he quoted his own question in it where he said, "What's the answer?" And he said the article ended with the first three words of her reply, "There isn't one." So she was kind of pissed off then because she was like, "Oh well, he's purposely kind of made it seem more like he's kind of for the pessimism,
More fatalistic,
pessimistic take, and quoting me in it, whereas actually I kind of left her more hope." And so she said that then the very act of trying to look ahead to discern possibilities and offer warnings is itself like an act of hope. And so she writes, it's interesting because she writes about how like there's what we were talking about, and we often talk about how difficult it is to predict how things are going to be, and that like basically she's like those kind of straight it's that there's so many unintended consequences and human reactions to things that and so we can easily be detoured into a future that defies any trend that we could have been predicted like a few decades before. And so she said some of the most mistaken predictions are the straight line variety that ignores this kind of inevitability of unintended consequences. Mm-hmm. So like in the future we will have more of whatever's going on right now. So like if there's prosperity, that in the future, we're going to predict a future prosperity. But if we're in a period of recession or something, or like negative things happen in the world, like for example, say in the last few years, when a lot of people say, there's like from maybe our political perspective, I don't know, kind of the rise of the right and things like that people of a certain political persuasion are kind of, we're thinking, oh, are we completely doomed? Or also stuff about issues with the climate, and that we're becoming more aware of these issues, and then we're thinking, God, like everything's fucked. So that but then so predicting like an impossible state of prosperity could also be like, because you're just in fear and you're kind of like, oh God, hopefully like it'll all be better in the future, and but then also predicting doom like might just have to do with how depressed we are in a certain moment without like a real insight into what is possible in the future.
Yeah.
So that she talks about how like fear and depression and like superstition as well play big roles in like on our attempts to predict the future. And I just thought it was interesting, like this kind of psychology of psychology of what we predict about the future. But I do think that, like I was saying with the sci-fi thing, like how we think the future is going to be, or the stories we tell ourselves about the future, will kind of influence what ends up happening. I mean, to some extent. So it's interesting to have, like, I think she brings this awareness onto, like, that fact of, like, we often have talked about, like, oh, funny, I wonder if people are going to criticize us for not being like pessimistic enough about the future, because it seems to be like, that's a lot of how we're talking about, things these days. But what does it mean to actually try to, I'm not saying like, oh, put your emotions aside and just think rationally about the future, because I don't subscribe to that kind of like we should set aside our emotions about things. But it's just interesting to look at what role like our emotions are kind of playing in things. So
I mean, it's a very striking difference that can result from a depressive outlook is just a pessimism about your personal outcomes. I mean, that's just one of the most predictable occurrences, and the subjective experience of that isn't that like you've suddenly just changed your heuristic. It's not like, oh well, now I've decided I need a certain probability of good things happening before I'll believe it. Instead, it's just the world literally can look like it's a terrible place, and then it can look like it's a fine place, some number of months or years later, and nothing's changed. It's just kind of an outlook. And as you say, it has a huge effect. And I think it really does. I mean, sci-fi. I think sci-fi does have a negative bias because not for any pernicious ideological reason, but just because in order to tell a good story, you need something bad to be happening. You like
You need a bit of drama.
yeah. You need someone to have fucked up.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting because it kind of leads me on to something else. Oh well, then I mean, the next part of what I want to say. Well, actually, she then. Yeah, well, what she said. Sorry, just the end part from that essay. Why would you predict the future at all if it's so difficult to do it? And then she kind of talks about how predictions is one way to give warning when we see ourselves drifting in a dangerous direction. And yeah, so a way of I just think that's an interesting part of what a lot of, I suppose, people who write sci-fi in this kind of more dystopian mode do. And that also can be, which some of her other books, it's not necessarily all like, oh, we're doomed, in this kind of warning thing. There's also this sort of, like you see in her books as well, this idea of like sci-fi novels kind of being like a thought experiment or something. Like what would happen if, because actually in this, I didn't mention it before because I want to talk about it on it by itself as well. The idea that like that Lauren, like the character in the first novel, well, basically, Octavia Butler had this idea to write a novel where people could feel and like share all the pain and pleasure that they caused each other.
Okay.
So kind of have this like empathic, like very like super empathic people, and kind of imagine what would it be like a civilization like that. And so that people would have to think, maybe not that people wouldn't necessarily treat each other badly, but they would have to kind of think a lot more about if they were going to do that or if they were going to hurt somebody else, also like emotionally, because they are going to get hurt as well automatically by that. But then she said in thinking about it more, how that would play, that would kind of play out, sort of thinking like, okay, this is sort of interesting because one thing is that she was like, okay, there's a lot of sports that people play nowadays that like, or even like boxing and stuff that people actually enjoy. You know what I mean? They might get hurt in it, but they also have enjoyment. So she was like, it wouldn't necessarily, if we were more empathic, it wouldn't necessarily mean we wouldn't hurt people. And maybe there are people who would enjoy actually feeling the hurt, hurting people and feeling the hurt as well.
Oh, yeah.
And then, but you also thought about like something like this, there's maybe certain professions and stuff that would be less desirable. Like in a society where that way we all felt each other's pain, like physical and emotional and mental pain that we cause other people. Like who would want to be a dentist? And like I just thought that was kind of like that was kind of funny. Like that was an example that she kind of had herself of like, would nobody want to be a nurse or a doctor because you also have to do things that cause people pain and like I don't know. So I don't know. I just thought that was interesting. So actually, she trained track to like she wanted to write a novel where there was one character who could feel had this super empathy, and so this is Lauren, the character in the person, the Parable of the Sower, but then actually it's also a certain point you sort of don't realize, like you think maybe it's an illusion. So she thinks she can feel people's empathy, but it's just an illusion. But then it's sort of this question of like, but it's still, does it matter if it's an illusion or not? Because if she feels that she's feeling other people's pain, it changes the way she acts with people. So, what does it mean if some people in society to kind of have a huge amount of empathy and other people not? But so I just thought like, so even when she writes about things that are trying to write about, say, futures where there's things that appear as what could be a really positive thing, it's also like, even in say that she didn't write that book about where everybody has this power, but also it was because when she was kind of working out and like what that novel could look like, it was like realizing that, I don't know, well, I guess she just changed tracks, but I just thought, you actually book often in novels you can play out. It's sort of like, I suppose, like a role playing, like there's this thing of, role playing scenarios to see like, oh, is this going to be a good solution for that scenario, or like yeah. And how to deal with, if you're getting trained, how to deal with difficult customers or whatever. It's like, it's one thing to say on paper, like, hey, just do this, or, just tell them no refunds. But like, it's another thing to have to try to argue that, like, and stay calm or whatever with the customer. So like, a kind of random example, I know, but like, there's something about trying to play it out in some sort of like, maybe not real, imagined scenario, or so that yeah, I just thought that was an interesting.
It's kind of a
an interesting
simulation
aspect.
process, really. I mean, it's
Yeah, kind of like a simulation, and so yeah, this thing about, and so this thing about like uh yeah, what role can science fiction play? Like she like um it's also interesting because I suppose she was quite pioneering in like, I suppose a lot of people see her as a central figure of futurism, which I suppose is sort of like yeah, like visions of the future in kind of in like books and movies and music, but from kind of a an African American perspective. Not sorry, I say African American. I suppose it's African and Black more broadly, but yeah, in the case of Octavia Butler, like sort of an African American perspective, because she's often writing, like she's generally writing in the future in America as well.
yeah.
And so she wrote another like interesting thing she wrote was in 1980 was an article called "Why is Science Fiction So White?" and or well that, yeah, she was writing about that, was also called like the lost races of science fiction. And so it's interesting because she writes about how like basically she disagreed with, like she was and when she was in college in like 1965, basically her teacher, creative writing teacher, was like, oh, like don't, you should maybe don't like write black characters into your like science fiction unless it's like central to the plot that they're black, because it's just going to be distracting or something. And she didn't really agree with that. She didn't really agree with that.
Understandably, yeah.
Because she was like, yeah, if there's black people in the world, if this is my experience as well, like why would it be distracting to
Worked for Star Trek.
to write it from that perspective? And that actually often what he said, and that was apparently a common view at the time, was like, no, instead of actually having different human races, like just make them aliens, just make them an alien race. So then it kind of is saying something about race, but like it's a bit more abstracted. We don't really, like, we're talking about race without really talking about race. Which, yeah, she in this essay she kind of goes into why that is just like very strange and weird and yeah, kind of offensive or something, to be like,
yeah,
like okay, these aliens are kind of a stand-in for black people, but we don't actually have to talk about problems of race because they're just aliens, but it sort of implies something about, like, it's sort of funny for a genre that like is kind of all about, like, say, not all about, but often, Star Wars and being like all these different races to an extent, or species kind of colliding in like fun bars on different planets or whatever, that like it's also been a very like very maybe not great representation at that time, in this, like, nowadays it's a bit better, I suppose, but there wasn't great representation of like people of color in terms of the characters or like the writers.
I think the writers where you'd find the biggest disparity. I mean,
yeah, exactly. But she talks about how like, but she she writes in this essay about how like, where science fiction writers come from, science fiction readers, and like she was saying, a lot of say African Americans weren't really reading science fiction or kind of that into it because they also weren't seeing character. You know what I mean? I suppose it's all kind of interconnected. They weren't seeing themselves reflected in those stories, so it was sort of like it wasn't really of interest to them, and it seemed like a very white kind of thing.
There is there's a famous story about I can't remember her name, but I did see her giving a talk once, and she was an actress in Star Trek, and she was a black woman, and she wanted to quit, and around the time that she wanted to quit the job, just for life reasons, I'm not sure if it was after she made a decision or anything, but she basically mentioned it to Martin Luther King, who had written to her or something. Maybe he met her, but basically he implored her to stay in the role because he loved the show a whole bunch.
Big fan of the show.
and he felt it was very important to have representation within it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a bit...
Yeah,
I mean, but like, yeah, okay. It's also like, who are you to tell someone what personal choice to make in your life?
Martin Luther King.
I suppose if anybody is, I don't know, if anyone's allowed to tell, I was going to say if anyone's to do, but I don't know what if that really.
I don't think it was taken badly. I think it was taken as a very flattering comment, which actually, I think, if I remember correctly, her perspective, one of the things she had felt weird about was that this was something that wasn't very connected to her community, and then he was making the point exactly that was sort of a problem with its own roots.
Yeah. And so another interesting part, if I can read out again. Sorry, I'm sick of quoting. I don't know. She just says a lot of good stuff. So, she talks about how science fiction has always been nearly all white, just as until recently it's been nearly all male. And so she said a lot of people have had a chance to get comfortable with things as they are, too comfortable. And she writes that science fiction, more than any other genre. What did you just break, Patrick?
I had to close the window because the dog was barking too much outside.
Okay. So science fiction, more than any other genre, deals with change in science and technology and social change. But science fiction itself changes slowly, often under protest. You can go to conventions and still hear deliberately sexist remarks, and but she says that like she doesn't think anyone seriously believes the future of the world will be white any more than anyone believes that the present world is all white. But the kind of custom or what people are used to, it's just so it's gonna be strong enough to prevent people from seeing the need for science fiction to reflect a more realistic view. And so that was something that I just found I find interesting, this thing of like sci-fi shaping how we see and imagine the future, which shapes how we work towards it or against it. So like even in one of her books, there's like, I think it's in the second one of these parable books. I think in the second one that like the one character is like books aren't going to save us, and then the one's like, no, just like collect, like basically saying, oh, you should at some point when they have to go and escape from somewhere and go to be out in the wild and I don't know, fend for their lives, like, okay, take whatever book, like maps and like reference books and encyclopedias and anything you can learn from, and they're like, and even take some fiction, like that's gonna maybe that's gonna help too. And like it really does, I do think fiction does and like culture, I suppose, and the arts and stuff does really influence so much of especially I suppose like things that have stories, like what stories we're reading, like it does influence like how we think and see the world, and like if we can see other people's perspectives or not, and like what kind of futures we are imagining. So I just think that it is like I don't know, that it is very important, like reading and did you say hang on?
I'm just agreeing. I think it's absolutely key, and not even just like the more abstract purpose or the specific purposes of people's, like many scientists can sort of trace their interest in a particular field to some story they were told. Even though it seems like they're so focused on the fine grain, that's actually just a sort of microscopic lens on often a much more purposeful. It's not true for everyone.
Exactly.
Of course, like it's very common.
Like people, like exactly, like people who were most scientists weren't just inspired to like get into studying, because of I don't know, something about it goes down to like molecular structure of this or about DNA, but there's usually some kind of the stars or like animals or some there's something that's a bigger, like you said, kind of more conceptual, like something you see that like, or a principle of something that you see around you everywhere, or like or it is like in stories or movies or I suppose things that like kind of are inspiring to you as a kid that maybe just stays with you then. And like I was thinking, so for example, like even now, like in terms of this thing about, maybe I didn't say much about like how that shapes our future, how we think about the future. Like just look at how people's suspicions about like robots and AI based on so many movies that are like like I, Robot and these kind of things. And like I mean, I think that's good that we have maybe it's topic for another podcast, but although we've been like not wanting to talk about those things, but so maybe not. But I think it's good that we have it's maybe that we have a healthy sense of skepticism around those things because of so many movies of like robots trying to kill us, or like AI trying to kill us, or like 2001: A Space Odyssey, or there's so many things. But like maybe it's a little overblown, but still I think better to be like skeptical than to be like just totally utopian and like, oh my God, this stuff is gonna make our lives just perfect and lovely. So yeah, so I think like that stuff is already really influenced how we see technology around us, like those kind of movies. So yeah, like I think reading and watching and giving space to futures imagined by more diverse, like a diversity of writers and artists and people is going to help us like warn us, as Octavia Butler was saying about like
Yeah.
sci-fi can be a warning or identify like issues before before a lot of other people are kind of aware of them. So the fact that she has so much like that's kind of stuff like this kind of racial politics in her books, whereas there's not, a lot of the other like Marche Four and Handmaid's Tale, that's not really present in them. Whereas that is
It's
right
present
now,
in
obviously,
the
like a
show, but not
huge
in the yeah.
what?
I think they introduced more of that into the television show, but it just wasn't in
Yes, possibly, but it wasn't really a big thing in
the
the in
books. No.
the in the book. But yeah, but that's the thing, I guess, because of the times they
Yeah.
are introducing that because it's like a huge thing, and also the kind of like socioeconomic, like I suppose she had a certain politics as well, Octavia Butler, and like yeah, the kind of socioeconomic issue and political. But it just seems that what like stuff in her books is she was so very well able to kind of I suppose take the temperature of the times that she was like living in the 90s and see all this stuff to come, as a lot of sci-fi writers often do. But I just think that like as in a lot of other areas, right now I suppose we need to be listening to people who are like already now saying,
Yeah.
I can't breathe or whatever, because that's where the kind of city of like the canary in the cage is that whoever is the most vulnerable people or precarious people are going to know ahead of everybody else how fucked up things are going to become, because they know it's fucked up way before it has, become visible to other people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and it's true. It's true that sci-fi is not a genre that has been historically rich in those perspectives, even in the older versions of them. I mean, I suppose you presumably had a lot of. I'm just assuming that there were a number of Jewish sci-fi writers, possibly in a time when of course those perspectives would have been a vital, sort of canary in the coal mine. But aside from that, I don't think that it's I think the issue of a lack of readers and a lack of it feeling like it's accessible, etc. Seems pretty. I mean, my understanding is the young adult fiction genre itself is kind of very diverse and very kind of focused on those issues. But I don't read enough to really have a sense of how much of that is just noise on Twitter and how much.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's become broader in that, like that, like young adult books and adult market is like a huge thing and a growing thing, and also kind of becoming more I suppose taken more, maybe getting taken more seriously, as like there's a lot of like just really great literature that's aimed at young adults, like aimed at teenagers. And I suppose I think there are a lot of fantasy. You know what I mean? It's, I suppose, because it's already its own kind of genre, this young adult thing. There's so many genres within that, so maybe it's like it doesn't, because this is kind of like the sci-fi section. Even on like it's like in the library or a bookshop or something. It's like it's not necessary. It's kind of a specialist section. There is this thing of like, actually, I read a really interesting interview with God, who was it with now again? Two authors. Hang on, what's it called? He wrote Very Giant. What is his name? Kazuo Ishiguro. Kazuo Ishiguro and someone else. Anyway, but so Kazuo Ishiguro, he has kind of fantasy, and there's bits of fantasy, but also I don't know. He's quite seen as quite a literary writer. But he talked about in this. Oh, it was with Neil Gaiman as well. That was the interview with the two of them, and or having a conversation or something. And then they were talking about how basically like it was more kind of about fantasy, but I suppose sci-fi be connected to that. That they were like
people,
before it was kind of invented by basically people who sell books and like bookshops and stuff. As like, oh, fantasy, we can kind of have a separate section and we can kind of target at specific people. Whereas beforehand, like The Hobbit and things like that, it was just like a literary it was just a book, a literary work, and like it wasn't really seen as like just a whole other niche thing. So yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that make the barriers to people, and sometimes it is when it's a separate genre that becomes marketed to certain people, like the barriers to people stopping people from reading or consuming certain content. But when it gets made into a TV show, that usually helps to overcome.
It does, and honestly, sci-fi and fantasy have both been doing very well recently. I mean, like if you look at like sci-fi, for example, like the most successful TV or movie franchise of all time, all those Avengers comics things, they use sci-fi themes very, very intensively. I mean, their quality can be debated, but there's no doubt that I think that a broader audience is being brought in. The Hunger Games was a huge one. That made a lot of people.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm happy about it. That it's like more because actually when I was like 13 or 14, all the like dystopian fiction was like the only thing I was reading pretty much. And but they was very, and that it was just I was just weird then, it was like Brave New World, which is some things I want to revisit, like Brave New World, because I feel like there was a lot of complexity in that I was aware myself, like the last big chapter where your man's making this big speech, and there's a lot of stuff about kind of like, say, I suppose pharmaceutical stuff in there, people being on drugs all the time basically, or being like medicated kind of all the time. And anyway, I felt there was a lot of stuff or kind of like philosophizing in there that as like a 13-year-old reading it, I was like a lot of big words, there's big things being said, I know it's important, there was definitely parts I was missing out on, but then there was other parts I was like, oh cool, it's crazy. So there's a lot of things I'd like to go and revisit that I read at that age, but they did have a big impression, like The Handmaid's Tale, really, like reading at that age was also
I really liked Fahrenheit 451. I thought that was cool.
I actually haven't read that. I think I tried to, but yeah.
Ray Bradbury is like pretty great. I actually recently I recently read a book of his that I hadn't read before, which was Something Wicked This Way Comes. Which is what? Which is Something Wicked This Way Comes.
Oh, okay,
yeah. It's more like horror fantasy than sci-fi, but I really enjoyed. But I feel the same way about a lot of those books. I mean, Fahrenheit 451, Brave New World, and 1984. I don't believe that I was paying attention.
I had an interesting, like, actually a few years ago I saw again the 1984 film with John Hurt in it.
I've never seen it now.
Oh my god, it's so good, you have to watch it. Anyway, but I watched it first when I was like about 14 or 15, but watching it again a few years ago, I had a very different, how I interpreted some aspect of it was very different, and I realized the main thing was kind of how I interpreted the romantic relationship in it, which, I won't get into the whole thing of it because it's not so relevant, but basically just that I realized that as a teenager I was geared to see romantic relationships in movies in a very narrow way,
Mm-hmm.
And then seeing it a few years ago, I was like, oh, it was this whole different dynamic going on in this relationship that I wasn't mature enough, I suppose, to.
So you were just putting it in the sort of like paper tray cutter shape. What's that expression? I forgot what that expression is.
Cookie cutter?
Cookie cutter, sorry.
No, not cookie cutter, but like, the cutting. Oh, God.
I think cookie cutter does the job.
Yeah, I know what you mean though. But anyway, I was going to ask you, but maybe we can it can be just a closing question, just a thinker for maybe to discuss another time or carrying us into some possible other reading topic. But I was so I know we didn't really discuss we didn't really discuss in details about or the futures that are imagined in these books, because it was more, I wanted to reflect kind of a more
sci-fi
more kind of in a broader way, and also this thing of kind of about like representation within, or like diversity within sci-fi. But I am interested in what you think about this idea of Earthseed, which is like this religion, like kind of like Darwinist religion, and like whether something like that might develop. I mean, probably there have developed in the last few years these kind of new religions that are kind of based on more on like ecological principles, but so because fundamentally that's the big thing. What?
We have yet to see if a lot of them have legs. I mean, like,
Yeah.
in order for a religion to really be considered a religion over time, it has to survive. And I do
Yeah.
think that overly engineered ideas about religion can often fall prey to just not meeting the needs or something that were met by the albeit flawed precedents. I would actually, I mean, it's.
But yeah, actually, maybe we would then people will go to sort of maybe like pagan belief systems that are more connected in with kind of like local, by local I mean more whatever, in the regions that people are living in, kind of ecological systems, as opposed to like something like, I don't know, the Catholic Church or something, for example.
I mean,
I think it's already a bit of a trend in Ireland, the old paganism, to be honest.
I think it's certainly possible, but it sort of is like it's part of the next page, although it's already slightly turned, of what religion means. It's a very very different meaning of religion once you talk about people who for example have a full awareness and enthusiasm for mainstream scientific findings and consider them to be authoritative on issues of reality or empirical reality or whatever, and consider public policy studies to be like the authority on what to do during a pandemic, but they are still engaging in ceremony around paganism. So it's definitely, I'm not going to say it's not a religion, but I'm just going to say it's not the same as what religion used to be. So it's kind of hard to interpret. But when it comes to the question of whether or not people might have a religion surrounding evolutionary processes, it's hard to see what would happen in the future. I'm kind of amazed it never happened in the past. The theory of evolution is one of those. I think it was a famous sci-fi writer. Let me name the right Huxley here. It was.
Aldous Huxley?
No, yeah, sorry. It was one of his brothers. It was another Huxley who was a biologist.
Oh,
okay. But I think they all had an interest. I mean, yeah, they were an interesting bunch. But anyway, it was another Huxley brother who said of Darwin's theory of evolution, it was something like it was the worst thing about it was trying to work out why you didn't come up with it yourself. It seemed very obvious to a lot of people. As a finding, as a theory, as an explanatory framework once it was described, which sort of makes you wonder, especially given that humans have been doing it to other organisms for so long, what would have happened if people had worked that. I mean, humans wouldn't have needed to become scientists to work out how the theory of evolution works. It's quite a simple algorithm, which is easily attested to by evidence that would have been surrounding humans throughout the history of our species. And I do often wonder what would happen if they had worked it out. But
wait, sorry. If you're saying if they'd worked it out about evolution much earlier, or
yeah.
what would you say?
Yeah, much earlier. I don't think you would have needed science to discover the theory of evolution as.
Yeah, but I mean, science use is good for a few other things as well. Like
no, of course, of course, it's most other things. I mean, the theory of evolution is amazing, but it's actually not necessarily hugely functional in any immediate experiment.
Well, actually, but I mean, the thing is, how do you know that people didn't figure it out beforehand?
Well, we don't know. It's an interesting question. There are some examples of precedents. I mean, so. We should say theory of evolution by natural selection. If you just say evolution, then there were ancient Egyptian scholars who almost certainly, described the idea that things came from the sea and got more complicated over time.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
But the theory of evolution by natural selection, there is one article I've read about a Scottish scientist who was not very well known, who seemed to capture a lot of the elements. There was an Arab philosopher scientist or whatever of the time who described emerging complexity, but again without the natural selection part. I guess the point is, if people had realized that they could consciously manipulate over generations, which again they were actually doing with livestock.
Yeah, exactly. I was just like, they were actually doing it. So they basically. What I'm just thinking is, surely there must have been, like in a lot of places, basically people must have kind of known or had some kind of understanding that that is what works, or that is like about what natural selection is. But I'm just thinking about the idea that like when we say, oh, this was kind of invented or discovered or something, we're talking about someone who was doing it within the framework of like the scientific method and maybe writing papers and being connected enough to kind of declare it as this kind of thing. Whereas, like the thing of, I don't know if this is a good comparison, but Christopher Columbus discovering America. It's like, yeah, people were like, there were people who were aware of it before, and how we talk about, I suppose, things being known. So yeah, are there things that did become were scientific discoveries, but maybe were knowledges that were held by people in other places, in a kind of culture that wasn't necessarily disseminating that knowledge, like as.
I mean, of course. I mean,
scientists.
it's certainly possible. I mean, if you're to assume, like, if the question is, did anyone ever think of it before Darwin?
Yeah, well,
Then the answer is probably. I mean, I personally am inclined to say the answer is probably yes. But it wasn't enough people,
Yeah.
or those people didn't convince enough people,
Yeah.
for there to be any record of it, as far as I can tell. And I have looked in the past.
Yeah,
And it's,
but I just mean that like it's also, I'm also question, like, for example, if you say, yeah, I'm saying within the framework of, like, say yeah, I don't know, like rational science, empirical, like science, empirical evidence. But like it's the same thing for if there's no records of, there's a lot of there's also like so many countries where beyond a few hundred years ago, maybe there were no written records at all about, so it's also this question of like how knowledge is like uh uh what you call it, like documented or passed on, or and there's some that are kind of held up above others. So
of course,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I guess I mean, there are examples of a sort of like European scientific notions that we have, and it wasn't algebra, but it was anyway. There were people
Al
who
Gore.
talked about these kinds of topics a huge amount in writings that we have. And it's just obviously those ones that we have to go off. I guess there is some temptation for me personally, given how much I love the theory of evolution, to assume that had any large number of people worked this out at any stage, the correctness of the information itself, right? Because it explains so much, would be to some degree self-sustaining. And I also think it would be impactful, assuming you take into account how in the kind of regimes that existed in the past, where small numbers of people had crazily disproportionate amounts of power, not that that isn't an issue today, then I think that you could see people using the capacities of artificial selection, because it's not like they had the option to divert funds into building rockets or something like that. Like, again, you don't because many other scientific findings that are super interesting and important, you actually just can't do without the accompanying structure of lots of other pieces of science and engineering. But the theory of evolution and breeding animals to do things
Big
for
old puzzle.
anyone can do that.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. Just looking at the time now, I feel like we should. It's very interesting. But maybe we should. Leave it
I think you're right. All right. Well, again, we still have no music because I only just installed this newest hard drive 2 days ago.
And Patrick still refuses to sing.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I was singing earlier, but now is not the time. I'll catch you next week, Joan.
Okay. Bye.
Great. Okay.